Before we get into 3D tracking and so forth for anamorphic footage, we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of a history lesson on anamorphic. I talked a little bit about this last time. It's important to understand throughout the history of filmmaking that there's been a lot of things that are kind of like standards in technology, but they've been used as gimmicks. For instance, the advent of the whole idea of using CinemaScope or anamorphic, or in this case, the beginning was Cinerama, which was basically three projectors projecting three different images at once, was to get people back into theater seats. Because television came around in the 50s, and basically everyone was like, okay, we don't have to go to theaters anymore, we can just stay at home. So there had to be a way to get things to work. So you gotta remember throughout history, whether it's cheesy 3D anaglyph glasses back in the day, or Cinerama with its three different projectors, or 3D with Avatar, or The Tingler with Vincent Price movies, where they would electrocute you while you watch a movie, or The Hobbit with high frame rate, where you get 48 frames per second and it ends up looking like a soap opera. There are different ways that Hollywood has constantly been kind of moving you or pushing you into the theater seats. Reality is anamorphic actually is a desperate necessity. So television arrived, film industry tanked, and they're like, how do we draw people? How do we get people back into theaters? Well, anamorphic was born out of a desperate need. It started with different aspects to achieve widescreen, one of which was three different film cameras which put forth three different projected images in what was considered to be basically Cinerama, and then Cinescope came around where they were starting to use anamorphic lenses and so forth. And then from there, this whole process was built. And it was basically the process of capturing an image onto a square image, basically capturing a widescreen image onto a square image or a film, film frame, because film frames were basically 4x3 and they had to film it within that little area. So the only way to do that was to actually do a cylindrical squeeze of the environment and unsqueeze it into the projection process. So you can see here incoming light would come in, your actors are right here, the image comes through, and it comes through basically a positive cylindrical lens and then a negative cylindrical lens. And in that process, it basically gets squeezed onto the image and stretched, and stored away. So hence, you've now squeezed the image. Now, I talked about this a little bit in my previous tutorials, but we have different aspect ratios here, 235, 239, based on the need for this little recording here on the side of audio. But throughout the process, they were squeezing, basically a rectangle image into a square image through this process, and in the process, you would actually project it out in the same way. So anyway, let's just kind of move on. What does that anamorphic look like? Well, we are so used to it that our brains immediately equate it to cinematics. When I first started shooting with the anamorphic lenses, my students were like enamored by the look, and it's because we've all been brainwashed to know that 24 frames per second is cinematic, that anamorphic look is cinematic, because we see it in all the big major motion pictures. These expensive lenses have this nice oval bokeh due to that stretch reality of when it gets kind of captured on the image plane. So it always looks really cinematic and really cool. It also has a flattering full-frame head with wide horizontal vistas. So you'll find the actors will commonly have a boxy square head, and the reason why is you're taking basically a lens, like in our adapters for instance, which are capturing, if this was a 50 millimeter up and down, you're really capturing close to 25 across if it's a 2x squeeze. So you're getting, basically a cylindrical stretch from left to right. And yet at the top and bottom it's 50. So it's really an interesting look. If you notice people start to look boxy, I was filming my friend Dallas and he was like, why do I look so fat? And I was like, well, dude, it's just the effect of anamorphic. It does give that kind of weird look. I always equate it to an old toy I had when I growing up, was called the Muscle Men, and they look like this. You guys probably never heard of them, but they had like sort of like kind of like a dwarf look to them. They were very squarish. Their heads were square, And, you know, I used to collect these as kids. But if you watch movies like anything by Michael Bay, Anamorphic, anything Anamorphic, you'll see the actors have this sort of look to them. They look like musclemen plastic figurines or dwarfs. It also has this interesting artifact of lens flares, which can go overboard, J.J. Abrams style. Also, they can be used to hide bad CG synthetically if they're added, you know, in post, obviously. But also, I mean, in this case, you know, when you're filming them, they can be a nuisance, or, you know, it depends on the coating of the actual lens. It depends on the lens itself, the light color coming through. It is a cool sci-fi-ish element that really makes your stuff look quote-unquote cinematic. And why do we equate it as cinematic? It's because we were brainwashed like that from children going to movie theaters and seeing this. So when we look at it, we go, oh, that's a movie. That's professional. So again, it's rather interesting how we've kind of been programmed into being told these artifacts or these sort of like flaws in a desperate attempt to get people in theaters by using this weird cylindrical process to capture images is actually what is considered to be professional. Anamorphic today is really expensive. You can see the Panavision G series, very expensive. Panavision, obviously, I believe just rents out their stuff. You very rarely can actually buy a Panavision lens, and for good reason, because they wear and tear, and Panavision has a name to uphold, and they, you know, are the industry standard, and they fix the lenses, and I mean, this is really precise glass, so a lot of money. The beauty today is that this company called Atlas is building out lenses that are actually very cheap. I mean, come on, $8,000? That's pretty cheap. When most Cook anamorphic lenses are close to $80,000, you know, for a set of 3 for this price is pretty affordable, I have to say. And then we have SLR Magic sets. I've heard negative reviews about these things. They're a little bit pricey for what they are, but you can get a set for, again, $8,500. If anything, I would get a PL mount adapter and get this Atlas Orion if I had $8,000 to blow. So if you're a pretentious film student, this is for you. If you got a rich daddy, you know, with a trust fund in your back pocket, you know, you're good to go. So, indie anamorphic. Okay, independent film anamorphic. I'm broke, but I want a cinematic look. I have a couple friends of mine that are doing these little techniques and so forth, and they're using these adapters from Anamorphicstore.com, which is actually based here in Chicago, where I'm at. And they're using old projector lenses. These lenses, whether they're German or Japanese, in this case is the Sankor lens, were actually used to project images, I believe, on flights. So these are actually projectors meant to project and stretch out the anamorphic footage for people to watch movies. Instead, this time they're using it as a capture device to bring it back in. And they're very sharp but very heavy, and there's a lot of work involved in dual focus. So you can see here that you have this adapter, you have your taking lens, which is right here. You have an adapter that fits the actual Sankor. Problem with these things, as you can see, to get wide-angle shots would be pretty difficult, because if this is your taking lens, which is basically a spherical lens, it gets basically captured with the cylinder approach here, but wide-angle lenses can't really escape through here without being hit by the actual side of the barrel. So it's like looking down a tunnel when you get the recording back. So again, it's not the greatest. They also have these range finders, because these systems require dual focus. So as you're focusing here, you got to focus here at the same time. But if you set these two lenses to infinity, you're capturing taking lens and your anamorphic lens. You set those to infinity, you can actually take this here, like for instance SLR viewfinder, rotate it, and when you rotate it, you can actually focus the actual image with one single dial. But again, you're putting one more element on the end of the lens here, which is going to make it hard for wide-angle lenses. Because remember, your lens starts here, basically. And if you're trying to capture wide, you're not gonna. You're only going to get anything from like maybe like 50 to 60 millimeter and above. Okay. So cool techniques. They do offer sharp results, more sharper than what I'm about to show you with the SLR Magic, but I find that these are the best. I did a lot of research, questioned a lot of people on YouTube, spent a lot of time doing research before I invested in this, and I finally came to this guy right here, the SLR Magic 50 1.33. I have a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K camera, and it has a 16:9 filming ratio, or 1.9 with the 4096. That was at by 2160 resolution. So this is the way to go, basically. Not so strong of a squeeze as opposed to the traditional movie squeeze, which has been all cinema history, which is 2.0. This really only works with the GH5S, which allows for a 4:3 sort of like square sensor to allow for that amount of squeeze. That's basically old Hollywood. So there's a couple adapters you guys might be interested in, and they have everything to do with this number here, 40, 50, and 65. This actually has to do with the diameter of your actual lens on your taking camera lens. It has nothing to do with the thread itself. So, you know, some of them have like a thread. In this case, whatever thread this is, I'm not sure what it is, but it's not the thread. It's the actual lens diameter being 40, okay? So there's 40, 50, and 65, okay? I believe it's millimeters if I'm not wrong. So anyway, so this is $500. Problem is, I didn't want to buy this one because you really can't get any bigger than 50 millimeter in this, because you can see I can't get a wide angle lens to fit through this. It's just too much. You might be able to get a wide angle lens. I think you can. I haven't really experimented on it. But it does give more of a cylindrical approach as opposed to more of an oval approach. This will give you a nice oval bokeh. This will give you a square bokeh. And a bokeh is like the out of focus area is little circles. So I said, well, I'm going to jump the gun here and go for this $8.99 version. And I am not sorry whatsoever. So it has a back thread. In my case, it's a 62 thread, and they have up-step rings to all types. So the threads that you have on any lens that you have can be attached to this, okay? So they also have the 2X. This is more for the GH5S, which can get away with it. And then you have the 1.3365, which I've heard mixed results on this one. It allows for bigger lenses, more full-frame lenses that are bigger. The bigger the lens, the bigger you got to make these adapters, because you got to get enough room for the wide-angle view to get through without you actually seeing through a drum, okay? So the bigger the better, so to speak. But in this case, I've heard that the results of this are a little bit weird. So I didn't want to go for this one, even though they claim it's a lot sharper. So anyway, this one everyone's saying is very cinematic and very movie. It has a lot more lens flares as opposed to this one. Okay. Again, they also sell at these different sites for SLR Magics 0.33, 1.33, and 1.88 diopters for close-up shots. These technically are magnifying lenses that you attach on the front end, like for instance on this thing right here. And that basically zooms in on the actor. So it's really weird. I'll go over it in a minute so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. How do these SLR Magic adapters work? Well, you have your camera, commonly a GH5 or a Blackmagic Pocket 4K. You can use a Sony camera as well. But you do want to have very small diameter lenses. This is actually an example of the worst you would ever have, okay? Small diameter lenses, no receding optics. So if you ever take a look at your lens and you look at the front end element of the lens and you see a hole, bad news, don't use that, okay? There's a big hole and then your lens is buried somewhere in that hole, don't get it. Small diameter lenses, the best. Again, this is working really good with certain sensors, such as 4/3 sensors, such as the GH5, as well as the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K. Very small lenses usually come with that, and that's what you want, tiny lenses. So this is a bad example you're seeing right here. So here's the process. The capturing sensor goes through the spherical lens. Anamorphic squeeze cylindricizes it. So if you have a 50 millimeter lens here, the anamorphic squeeze, depending on your squeeze size, will start to give you a 50 up and down and maybe a 35 across. In this case, if we're doing a 1.33 adaptation, don't ignore this 1.33, it's different anyway. And then you have a magnifying lens, which magnifies the image by a certain degree, which is diopters. These are optional, but if you do intend to film very extreme close-ups or pretty big close-ups, maybe 1 to 3 feet away, or even less than that, or if you want to do macro photography, you want to get these diopters. I actually got a 1.88 that came with the kit that I bought for about $1,000 with the SLR Magic 50. So these things are very, very handy, and I found I used them and they work really well. It's sort of like a weird thing. Your face cannot, in the final image, depending on your millimeter lens, specifically long lenses, you can't get too close to the actor and it won't focus. So you have to zoom in on the actor. So technically, you can take basically these anamorph lenses. You can't get too close to the actor physically, but you can use magnifying lenses to get them into the frame closer and closer. So it's a bit weird. I'm still trying to figure it out myself. So bear with me. Limitations of the cheap way using this SLR Magic adapter. Well, make it the best work that you can. This is an example of a bad example. Big lenses are no good. So you can see this big lens. If you try to put this thing at like a 30, anywhere from a 20 to a 35 millimeter, you're going to get this result. It's going to look like you're looking through a drum. Okay, you're not just going to see vignetting. You're going to physically see the actual drum. You're going to see the sides, and you can see the reason why. The lens, the diameter of the lens I talked about earlier, being big, can't get out of this actual lens. So large lens diameters set to wide angles cannot get through the lens length of the lens barrel without vignetting or showing the actual barrel. So you'll get this kind of look. So here's the solution. Small lenses are good. So there's a lot of vintage Voigtlander, Nikon, of course, Panasonic Lumix, pancake lenses, depending on how soft you want those things to be, are good results for that because they have very small lens diameters for the wide angles, and you can still get f-stops as low as 1.8, 2.0, and so forth. So you can see this allows the image to escape out, and you get more of a wider look, which is always the battle here with all these crazy scopes. So you can see there's no vignetting. Limitations on this cheap way: small lens diameters, not lenses. So even though these two lenses are exactly the same size as far as diameter, might even have the same thread, which would be like, in this case, I'm trying to see what it says there, that's 46, and this might be a 46 as well thread. What you should be looking at is the physical glass. Okay, so if you touch your lens and you actually feel the glass, this is the actual diameter of the glass itself. Okay, this is usually not labeled on any website, not B&H or any sort of place where you would buy it. So you would have to kind of figure out on your own just by pictures that you would look at. So you can see here, this is going to work way better with this, because if this is the actual barrel of the lens for the adapter, it's going to get through and you're going to capture the entire wide angle look. With the same exact length of this here, you can see it's going to hit a wall, and you're going to get that look where you're looking down the barrel. So for instance, I actually shot some footage with the Olympus 9 to 18 millimeter, and I couldn't even, everything from 9 to about 17 millimeters was looking through this barrel. It wasn't until I zoomed into 18 that I could actually break through all the way, which was giving me a 36 millimeter equivalent roughly with the 1.9 crop factor. So anyway, limitations again. You're going to get a soft image if you use cheap lenses with 1.4 to 4.0 f-stop. I'm not even going to be talking about 0.98 or whatever. But here's the thing. Cheap kit lenses, you're going to be limited to 4.0 f-stop or higher, or you're going to get a soft image in the center of the frame, not to mention the edges. Cheap Panasonic Olympic kits, zoom lenses, it's the way it is. You still can get good stuff the second you hit 4.0. It's pretty much clean as when you get to 4.0 or higher. You're sacrificing the ability to have shallow depth of field, areas that are basically out of focus in the background. So again, sharp modern vintage primes, again working with primes and not zooms, you can go as low as 1.4 f-stop, still have a nice clean image, and you'll still have like a touch of blur in the corners. But if you watch any anamorphic films or very artsy films you'll see, such as Code 46, you'll find that they do have a little bit of vignetting. They do have a little bit of like blur on the edges here. That's artistic standpoint. Again, Lost in Translation, another example of that artsy sort of vignetting. Examples of good lenses: Pentax, Zeiss, Nikon, vintage lenses. Again, you can also use the Metabone speed boosters to adapt, specifically the Nikon speed booster. You can also do EF speed boosters for Zeiss glass. So anyway, let's talk about SLR Magic 50 Anamorph recommended lens combos. This is to assemble your wide, medium, and long lens setups. Note this is only for micro Four Thirds sensor setups, GH5, Blackmagic 4K. So, if you looked at those sets of lenses by, Atlas and, Panavision, you're most likely going to see a range from like, when it comes to anamorphic, you're usually going to find a range from 35, 40, 50, 85, maybe 100. That's basically it. Those are basically the 4 or 5 primes that consist of what most major anamorphic films are shot on. You might say it's kind of limited, but that's just the way cinematically it is, because remember, you're not just getting a 50 millimeter lens, you're getting a 50 across and 50 up and down and 25 across. Okay, if it's, depending on your squeeze factor. So even though you may see, oh, that's a 50 millimeter, it's actually whiter than you would imagine. Okay, so the widest that I've seen these people working with this adapter get is supposedly 28 millimeter, but that's questionable. I'm still experimenting. They're using speed boosters, and not forgetting, they're using like basically very, very tiny lens holes, basically, that allow for the image to get through. And so 28 divided by 2, right, is a 14 millimeter lens. So people are using pancake 14 lumixes and managing to get a 28 millimeter through this thing, which is pretty amazing. Okay, and remember, it's 28 up and down, but it's also like 16, 17, 18 across, so it's pretty wide. Right here is where things are. This thing is pretty wide looking. Okay, I would equate this, as far as the feel, to something more along the lines of like 25 millimeter, maybe, and this would be more like 18 millimeter. So these are the two areas where you're most likely going to be filming anamorphic, the 35 and the 50. So you can see the range with this thing is really between 28 and 100. You can't go any higher. And through the recommendation from people that have used this, for the widest, you can use speed boosters with Nikon lens, Voigtlander, Zeiss. You can use pancake lenses as well. Specifically the pancake, I think it's a pancake 2.8 Lumix 14 millimeter, which equates out to about 28 millimeter after the crop factor. Medium 36 millimeter, weird number, usually it's 35, but you're usually taking this, and you're taking the crop factor can get kind of weird, because it's a 1.9 crop factor with the Blackmagic, 2.0 with the actual GH5. Speed booster, again, Nikon lens, Voigtlander, Zeiss. These are sharp lenses, very small lenses. They work well. Okay, what I'm showing you here will allow you to go to 1.4 f-stop and higher. I don't know about 0.98 or whatever, but anyway, long lens, you're 50. This one I've heard is a real tricky to get right with this. I've heard the Voigtlander, specifically the pancake lens, the Nikon. There's a 50 pancake lens by Nikon. I think it's like a 2.8 or 2.0. That's the one that he says is pretty good. Voigtlander, Zeiss, again, using speed boosters. You don't want to use speed boosters, from what I can tell, possibly from 50 to 100. You want to just use a dumb adapter, which is basically a cheap adapter that basically adapts from 4/3 to Nikon or something, and allow for the crop factor to extend the millimeter length of your lens. And please don't get into a debate with me about it's not changing the millimeter lens with the crop factor. I understand that, so please don't. We don't want to go down that road. I understand it has to do with field of view, but basically you can take a 50 pancake lens, and if it's using a speed booster, you can get rid of the speed booster, put a dumb adapter on it, and immediately you've been increased to 100 millimeter. Okay, so using the same lens, but you're using a cheap another adapter besides a speed booster, because if you're not familiar with speed boosters, they actually sort of, to a certain degree, maintain the millimeter lens of your, and kind of destroy the crop factor to a certain degree by certain numbers, usually by 0.71 or 0.6 something. Again, a lot of jargon. But when it comes to these longer lenses, you got to be very careful. And I've heard the recommendation is don't use any speed boosters. Use dumb adapters and use these other lenses to make the extension. They're a little bit tricky when they start going from 85 to 100, I've heard, in regards to focus. So, but you can do it. Okay, just look around. I'll put some links up. Okay, resolutions of the finalized 133 and 2.0 post squeeze. So this is something just FYI. I found it took me some time to figure all these numbers out, but Anamorphic 50 1.33 for your 16:9 sensors. Okay, the 1.33 crop version of the Anamorphic is for 16:9 sensors only. The Blackmagic Pocket 4K doesn't film in 4:3 mode or square mode. It only records 16:9 or 1.9. And again, that's basically 4096 by 2160 or DCP, 4K DCP, or 3840 by 2160 UHD 4K. Okay, so it starts out at 1:9. With that squeeze, you get a 2.51. You could always zoom up and crop it to get to a 235. Ultimately, you end up with the same resolution as you would get here, which is 16:9 going to 235 if you just use this resolution. It's important to note that the only questions I always had in regards to using this if you're doing feature films is if you look at the Netflix requirements for the resolution, they do require a horizontal resolution of 4096 minimum. They're not a fan of this 3840. So will they allow you to have anamorphic at 251? That is actually a committee that decides that according to their website. So just be aware of that. Okay, so you can see the two different ways from which the 1.33 crop and the final resolutions end up being this 4096 by 1634 or 251 aspect ratio, or the 235 aspect ratio 3840 by 1634. So those are the real resolution numbers, especially when you're doing with CG. You want to be aware of these. You can down-res these half-res to 2K DCP and 2K whatever. But you see Anamorphic 50 2x. Okay, you can see the squeezes again. A lot more squeeze going on there, but that's only going to work with film, which had always been traditionally 2x, and the Panasonic GH5S, which is one of the few cameras that allows for a square image. Now, it does have a 4:3 mode. There is a 16:9 mode, which means you can still use this filter over here if you want to pay for a cheaper price and use it on the 16:9 powers. The 16:9 is this red, so the sensor is 17:3 by 13. It's important to note the Blackmagic has a much longer horizontal sensor size. I mean, look at this. This is 18 by 96, but a smaller vertical sensor size as opposed to the Panasonic. So here are the different sensor sizes being used of that sensor. And in our case, this case 4/3 would be this blue horizon, which gives you a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is traditionally what the film capture size was on a typical film negative, with the 4 sprockets on one side and the 4 film sprockets on the right side. So what that does is allow you to do a 2-time squeeze. So you're going to get more of the anamorphic and more longer oval bokeh. So you're going to go to 4:3 to 235, and after the squish, your resolution is about 3640 by 1549. That's still pretty low compared to if you take a look at these other resolutions of the Blackmagic and the this guy right here. So again, it's you got to choose if you're trying to go for if you can trick Netflix. I don't know if you can do that, by just up-resing your image and sharpening it, or whatever process you do to get this to a resolution that sits at the requirements that Netflix wants. Why am I pushing Netflix? Because Netflix is one of the few streaming services that actually provide information as far as requirements for what they would have their filmmakers work on, whether it's them buying the movies or them producing the films. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on the requirements in that respects. So, recapping limitations on the Anamorphic 50. The limitations are, you could say 28 to 100 millimeter, but for the 28 millimeter, your only result to get 28 millimeter is the 14 millimeter pancake Lumix. That's the smallest it gets. That little, it's like almost practically a pinhole. So 35 by 100 millimeter limitation, but honestly, do you really film anything outside of that? I don't. There might be some shot I can maybe do something with, or even maybe just cheat it and crop a full frame and, put it in the shot. I haven't really experimented with combining spherical shot work with cropped spherical work with anamorphic squeezed footage and just see if it matches correctly. But I'm sure you could probably get away with it if you're trying to go for something more than 100 millimeter. Slight blur on the edges in wide shots. Again, as you get closer to those edges of that, that half circle that is cylindricizing your footage, you're going to start to see a little bit of like maybe blurriness. I haven't seen much of it, honestly, from what I've seen. It depends on your f-stop. Possible vignetting in low light. I've seen a little bit of that. Small lens, requirement for wide. Again, going back to possible vignetting in low light. The longer your lenses are, your taking lenses are, and the longer your adapters are, your actual anamorphic adapters are, the more you're possibly going to get that vignetting in low light. Small lens diameter requirement for wide, like I mentioned. Pancake lenses, vintage lenses, small lenses, small diameter of the actual glass piece itself. Sharp taking lenses do get non-blurry, okay? So, in other words, 1.8 to 3.5 f-stops. So in other words, you got to get those nice lenses that are crazy tack sharp, so that when they go through the actual anamorphic, they maintain their quality. They might have a little bit of a quality hit, but it's going to be pretty sharp by the time it's on the end. Some people actually don't like that sharpness that is typical of your Blackmagic and GH4. They call it a clinical look, and the clinical look is just too sharp. Film is really not that sharp. Go watch movies on your iTunes or whatever. Take a look at the actors. Look how blurry they are. Dual focus can be tricky, but worth it. There is a dial, which I have not mentioned, that goes between normal and I think it's normal and close or something, and it's basically a dial you dial back and forth, which moves the back element of the back anamorphic lens element forward and backward. So if you have something that is, basically, I think it's like 3 feet or something, 20 feet or something, where it's close to the camera, you got to like put it to close, and then you got to put the other back to normal if you're trying to focus something far away. I've had no problems with it, honestly. If I know an actor is really close to camera, I just put it, to close, and I never have a problem focusing. Put it to normal whenever I'm filming stuff far away. Infinity focus and so forth. So these are all limitations, but it's important to remember to embrace limitation. The reason why I bring this up is the fact that we have seen a reality where the lack of limitation has created a laziness from which we have bad work. So back in the day, people like Ridley Scott had limitations when they shot Blade Runner. They didn't have CG, right? And they had a backlot. They did the best that they could do with it, and did a great job with what they did. And they didn't have all the tools. They didn't have all the toys. And you can say the same was for Star Wars. Star Wars could have been filmed in anamorphic, but they chose to film it 65mm spherical, the original Episode 4. And they did it for the fact that they needed to put visual effects in the movie. And it turned out great. Okay? Today, filmmakers are making, okay movies with access to everything. So don't be afraid of limitations just because it's like I can't get this f-stop, or I don't have 16 stops of latitude, or da-da-da-da. Don't make those excuses. Just make really great films and work with what you got. Really, it's your story that's going to basically draw people in, ultimately. Your story and your characters. So with that said, in the next lesson, we're going to actually jump in and get involved in this whole process of shooting, tracking, putting CG into anamorphics.